Everybody, and I want to again apologize that I'm running a little bit late. We had the blue light ceremony for the fallen law enforcement officers. It's an event where we have an opportunity to recognize those that are currently serving and those officers that we've lost in the line of duty. So I was at a good, important event, but I apologize to keep you waiting. I want to reserve some time tonight to really respond to what questions you have about the Attorney General's office, political questions about anything that we're doing. And so I thought I'd just take a few minutes and give you an update on the Attorney General's office, and then an update on some of the litigation that we're engaged in, and then really open it up for any questions that you guys have. I do want to thank you, and I think the most important thing I do is thank you tonight. I mean, I'm obviously an elected official. I'm a Republican leader. I'm a down ticket politician, which means obviously senators and governors sometimes take precedence, and I have to depend greatly upon folks like you to spread the good word, to help me out, and you guys have done a wonderful job for me. So I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And I know Rich Satgas would say the same thing, that we're kind of a Republican team, and you guys have done us very well, and thank you very much. One of the most important things, if not the most important thing, that the Attorney General does in South Dakota is work to build teams to protect communities. And some things that we've done in the Attorney General's office really focus on crime prevention so that we're able to stop crime from happening. Protecting children has been very important to me as Attorney General. I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. But irrespective of that, we see way too many instances when children are sexually abused in South Dakota. That's why we have a child abduction response team, so that if, God forbid, something were to happen to a child in South Dakota, we have a nationally certified team that gets resources right away to the local law enforcement that knows where to put those resources to use to protect that child. We have one of the top sex offender registries in the nation. Through the help of the legislature, they gave us the tools, and then we, being law enforcement, local sheriffs, and state's attorneys, have put together a database so that parents, grandparents that want to see where dangers lie can go check on that. Internet crimes against children, we have one of the strongest task forces in the nation. We're aggressive. We ran sting operations at the rally and in Rapid City earlier this summer, so that the bad guys come to meet a law enforcement officer instead of a young little child. But it was a wake-up call to see that about a dozen individuals went to respond to have sex on a Backpage.com with a 12-year-old little girl. So there's more work to be done, but those are some of the things that we're doing on the prevention end. I've been a big believer as Attorney General to lead from the front, to lead by example. So I personally have been active in many of our most infamous capital cases in South Dakota, from the Mueller case to the prosecution of John Graham to the prosecution of Eric Robert and Rodney Burgett for what they did to Officer Johnson. But aside from that work as a prosecutor, another important responsibilities of the Attorney General is to both preserve and protect individual and states' rights. I think probably one of the best examples, and I don't want to spend too much time on it tonight unless I get asked about it, is health care, where a group of us said that when that ObamaCare came into place, we felt it trumped upon state and individual rights. And we were partially right. The United States Supreme Court, and of course the talking heads never talk about it, I mean, the United States Supreme Court said Congress violated your constitutional rights in two ways. Number one, when they said that they passed the individual mandate based upon the Commerce Clause, they were wrong. The United States Supreme Court said that was a Commerce Clause violation. It was a tax and spending clause got them through it, but the reason and rationale that they used was deemed by our highest court to not be appropriate. But equally as important was Medicaid and the coercion part of Medicaid. The United States Supreme Court said that the action of Congress and the President violated the state's constitutional rights, federalism, that partnership between the states and the feds, when they passed that. And that's why our legislature and our governor now have that opportunity to talk about whether Medicaid expansion is right for South Dakota. Another example of that protection from the civil enforcement side of the Attorney General is with the EPA. The job of the Attorney General is to help preserve and protect our natural resources. We do that two ways as Attorney General. Number one, I'm the lawyer, our office is the lawyer for the Department of Natural Resources. So when DNR gets into a fight with the EPA or DNR feels that something needs to be done, we serve as their lawyer to protect their interests. The other thing we do as Attorney General is we enforce. If the law says a company can't dump something, or if a farmer can't do something and the permits aren't followed, the Attorney General comes in and enforces that. And we have had a lot of challenges when it comes to the EPA, and I say we at South Dakota and other states, because the EPA has really ignored long-standing precedents. They've taken action to expand their authority without, at least in my legal opinion, as well as other attorneys general, without congressional authority. They've done that with cap and trade. We all know that Congress talked about cap and trade, but it wasn't time. No decision was made to do anything with cap and trade. But cap and trade is very much happening right now. CO2 regulation is occurring by the EPA. What they've done is they made some bureaucratic endangerment finding. They're moving forward to now take the steps to begin regulating and permitting carbon dioxide. The problem with that is the way they're doing it, without necessarily supporting proof and science, is it will affect anybody from dry cleaners to hospitals. Most recently, another step by the EPA was with sulfur dioxide. North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas, Nevada, and it's important to point out Nevada because not everything is always bipartisan. Nevada's Attorney General, Catherine Masto Cortez, is a Democrat Attorney General, sued the EPA for what they've done to our state. The EPA has taken a position that a state can regulate sulfur dioxide if you do certain steps. In my legal opinion, and in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and peers' opinion, we did everything that the EPA asked us to do, yet they're refusing to authorize us to regulate SO2, and they're continuing to do it. By their inaction, we aren't able to really protect our state natural resources. But probably the most difficult thing that I have being a former U.S. attorney with dealing with the EPA is the lack of government transparency. The federal government refuses time and time again when state attorney generals that are tasked with the responsibility of protecting our natural resources, ask them for documents, ask them for why they're doing something, which is called the Freedom of Information Act request. They tell a sister agency, federalism, no, you can't have these documents. So even though we're going to force you to do things, we're going to make you do certain permitting, we're going to make you attorney generals enforce certain laws, we won't give you the basis of why we're doing that. And so, fortunately, I have a lot of good colleagues as attorneys general that we've joined to challenge the EPA time and time again. I'm just returning from the Republican Attorney General fall meeting. Right now, as it stands, there are 25 Republican Attorney Generals and 25 Democrat Attorney Generals. I'm afraid because of what's going on in Virginia, we may well have lost the Virginia Attorney General, and so now it will be 26-24. I don't know what that all means when it comes to some of these enforcement cases and some of the things that we do. But I do want to say, with respect to my colleagues, we've been able to, as an organization, I use as an example the sulfur dioxide case where Nevada's joined. Healthcare was another example where many Democrat attorney generals, and it was always interesting enough that Chris Koster, who was the chairman of the Democrat Attorney Generals Association, the Attorney General of Missouri, declared that Obamacare was unconstitutional. So no matter what the Senate said and no matter what Congress did or didn't do and the President, even the Democrat Attorney Generals knew what their responsibility was to their citizens, but we're entering some unknown time. The other things that the Attorney Generals have been working on, I talked a little bit about health care, a little bit about the EPA, is our concern with what's going on with tobacco. Oftentimes we Attorney Generals don't necessarily get into legislative functions, get into health functions, but we kind of sometimes become the last line of defense. And you may recall that nobody was doing anything about the tobacco problem in the United States until, frankly, one brave Mississippi Attorney General named Mike Moore, I had an opportunity to introduce him at a recent function, decided to sue Major Tobacco. And we were able to ultimately bring together what was called the tobacco settlement, where some people don't know this, but South Dakota receives between $23 and $28 million a year on that tobacco settlement. And part of the job of the Attorney Generals is to utilize that money to address some of the healthcare issues that tobacco deals with, but to also ensure and deal with youth smoking. And recently, because of technology, we now have e-cigarettes. And I think you've probably seen some of the blue ads and some of the other ads. And what we're seeing as Attorney Generals now is what's going on with these e-cigarettes is a challenge that we need to make sure that we outlaw them for minors because there are health issues. There's a tax issue, but we Attorney Generals feel that the federal government should regulate that aspect of it. But if the federal government won't, our legislatures are going to have to make some decisions. And then what we're also seeing with the e-cigarettes is the synthetic drug use, where the companies, there's two ways to make a synthetic cigarette. One is a closed system, which is basically two computer chips, and if you take it apart, it's tamper-proof, and you can't use it again. And then there's the open cigarette, which you pull it apart, you put some synthetic drugs in. If you're a 15-year-old, put it back together, and you have all kinds of medical problems and emergency situations, and it's a bad deal. And so that's one of the issues that we Attorney Generals met upon and that we're working on. Human trafficking is another issue. You may recall that I led the charge. There was three of us, me from South Dakota, Chris Koster, the Democrat Attorney General from Missouri, coupled with the Washington Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson. We put together 48 Attorney Generals about Backpage.com. Some of you maybe haven't heard about Backpage.com. To give you a feel for Backpage.com, when we ran that sting out in the Rapid City area in the Sturgis rally, you may have heard about it, we put an ad on Backpage.com, we, the Attorney General's office, selling a 12-year-old little girl. And they don't have any controls in place, so they put the ad up on their system, and people start showing up to buy little girls. And we felt as Attorney Generals that we would like to do something about it. But Congress, in the lack of their infinite wisdom, passed a statute, it's the CDA, Section 230, that says we give immunity for all these internet companies from state prosecution. Federal authorities can still prosecute, but state attorney generals can't. So 48 of us came together, Republican and Democrat, and said, you know what, Congress, obviously the feds need some help, they need our resource assistance, and so we proposed a fix. We're working through that. I'm happy to report, been in communication with Senator Thune's office, they're extremely helpful, and we're going to be able to see some progress there. And hopefully be able to address what Backpage.com is doing. Craigslist is another one that does it. There are issues with Google too, where you can purchase illegal substances off their sites. And all we're asking as Attorney Generals is to say, look, put some protections in place. Don't allow some bad guy to put his daughter up and sell her for I think we were selling them for $230 on the internet. That ought to be illegal, and if the feds can't get it addressed, let us deal with it. So those are some of the areas that we Attorney Generals feel very strongly about, that we are working on. Probably one of the biggest differences between my Democrat colleagues and my Republican colleagues is the general philosophy of business. Most Republican Attorney Generals, like myself, believe in a limited government. I believe most of the time things can be dealt with better on the local level. There are very few instances when you will ever see me as Attorney General say that the federal idea is better. Tobacco's one. I truly believe it would be better for the federal government to have one uniform policy dealing with those problems with e-cigarettes and some of the tax issues than 50 different ones. But for the most part, we believe in a very limited government, very pro-business group of attorneys general, feel that for the most part, we want to protect legitimate business by giving us the authority to address the inappropriate scams. But for the most part, if government leaves people alone, everybody else is better off. Now, I can go on and on and on about some of the things that we're doing. I want to touch just a little bit, because I got some legislators here, and so I get that free pop at them for legislative session, about some of the things that you can expect the Attorney General's office to be looking at moving forward this upcoming session. One of the other roles of the Attorney General is the protecting consumers. We have a consumer division. The consumer division is made up of essentially 7 to 8 people, depending upon how you want to count it, a lawyer and investigators. And we have statutes that allow us to protect our citizens from deceptive trade practices. We haven't really done anything with those statutes since 1971. So we formed a consumer task force made up of legislators, businessmen, lobbyists, you name it, they're on it, a group of as many as 70 stakeholders. I want to personally thank Senator Otten. He chaired the committee, which is a big task. And they put together a group of recommendations, and I'll just call it that, recommendations for the Attorney General to consider, and I plan on moving most of those recommendations forward. What they're really designed to do is make sure that we have in place the ability to ensure that legitimate businesses can operate in our state without unnecessary regulation. But if you come into our state and you rip off young people, if you pull that grandmother scam that went across my desk the other day where a little old lady sent $75,000 out of South Dakota to some bad guy about thinking she was helping her grandson that was in jail who really wasn't in jail, that we'll never get that money back. That's what those statutes are designed to fix. The other thing the Attorney General plans to do something about is pseudoephedrine. We already have more methamphetamine cases this year than we did last year, and we still have a couple more months to go. Methamphetamine's on the rise in South Dakota, so is methamphetamine manufacturing. The reason is, back when I was a young prosecutor prosecuting methamphetamine labs, it was a big production. It took a lot of pseudoephedrine, a lot of different chemicals, and a big operation to be a manufacturing, and so it cost a lot more money, and it was easier for law enforcement to find. Now we call them one-pot labs, basically because of technology. Anybody can come in with a little bit of pseudoephedrine and make methamphetamine. You can Google it on the internet and find out how to do it. So we're going to bring a pseudoephedrine bill, but I mentioned, that's sometimes the difference between a Republican and a Democrat Attorney General. I brought in business. I included the South Dakota Retailers Association. We've been meeting with pharmaceutical companies just this week at the Republican Attorney General's meeting to say, look, we want to put in place a plan that will work, that will not unnecessarily affect businesses, and yet control the pseudoephedrine sales so we can address methamphetamine. I've openly said I oppose making pseudoephedrine or cough medicine a prescription drug. I have to believe there's a better way than government to make you go see a doctor to get cold medicine. And I think this is the way to do it, and we're pretty much there. I just received some emails that indicated businesses now supporting our legislation. So those are some of the areas that we plan on bringing to the legislature. Human trafficking is an issue you're going to hear a lot about, and it's important for me to keep an open mind. I've seen human trafficking when I was U.S. Attorney. I prosecuted the hotel couple in Oklahoma when they brought in the Philippines ladies. It wasn't a sex trade, but it was certainly a work human trafficking where they basically would find roadkill deer, feed it to them, make them work incredibly long hours under incredibly bad conditions. We have that going on in South Dakota. Not to a great deal, but every once in a while, every couple years, there's one of those cases. So we're looking at potential legislation to strengthen our human trafficking laws. I've openly said there's really a couple things to consider whenever you hear about human trafficking. You'll hear a lot more about it during legislative sessions. The substantive laws. Do we need to have another law that says human trafficking is a felony and it gives the prosecutor this many tools? I like our kidnapping statute. If you really consider what a human trafficker does, they kidnap somebody. They kidnap somebody that's vulnerable, either a young lady or a child. And right now in South Dakota, if you kidnap somebody or hold them inappropriately against their will, you can get up to a life sentence. So as a prosecutor, I don't know that I need anything more than that, but I will keep an open mind. The other thing is there's a concern that sometimes a victim is forced to do illegal acts or put in situations where they break the law. And there needs to be some legal protection for them when that happens. I agree. Right now we're fortunate in South Dakota that the legislature once again has given prosecutors a tool called immunity. That we're able to give prosecutorial immunity, so if a victim of human trafficking were to testify, we can give them that immunity. The only thing we can't give them immunity for is perjury. And I wouldn't want to give somebody immunity for perjury because I would hate to see somebody convict an innocent man or woman. And so we kind of already have that aspect, but again, it's important that we keep an open mind. But the one area that, in my opinion, that we're lacking and that I intend to look at bringing legislation on is what we call the forfeiture laws. It's a unique concept that we say when somebody does something really bad, we're going to take away from them the means that they caused that crime with, and we're going to use it against them. We do that in the drug forfeiture laws right now. In other words, if a drug dealer has a bunch of guns and they get caught with them, we'll take away their guns, we'll sell their guns, and we'll use that money rather than legitimate, innocent taxpayer money to further the fight on drugs. And I'd like to see us have some type of a statute that says if you're going to human traffic, in addition to being able to prosecute you criminally, I'd like to be able to see that we're going to take away your possessions that you used to do that crime, and we're going to give that money back to either law enforcement efforts or to victims. I think it makes sense. It protects innocent taxpayer money, which frankly is the Republican way. And I think it's something that the legislature should take a strong look at. So those are some of the areas that we plan on moving forward. I fully anticipate that there will be issues on medical marijuana again. I've already been told that one representative is going to be looking at the capital punishment. So you'll be seeing a whole lot of issues this legislative session, but I plan to be an active Attorney General. I've always respected the legislature. They have always given me an opportunity to say my piece, but at the end of the day, they make the policy and the decisions, and I will defend that. A couple of additional updates, just so you know what else we're doing in lawsuits. Prayer at governmental events. I say that because the case is really prayer in the legislature, but it expands across the board, is now before the United States Supreme Court. And as Attorney General, I joined on behalf of South Dakota in support of the concept that you ought to be able to have prayer before a governmental function. It ought to be reasonable. I mean, it's prayer, not preach. But that if you look back in our history, when our founding fathers of South Dakota formed our Constitution and formed our state, they began it with a prayer each session. Every time we go to the legislature and begin session, we begin it with a prayer. And I think that's appropriate. And I think it should be up to the individual governmental organization to decide that. As long as they don't go too far and make people feel uncomfortable with that preaching aspect, there's a time and a place, then I think that ought to be legitimate. And I don't think that the First Amendment forbids that. The United States Supreme Court's going to hear it. It's a pretty divided group of attorney generals on each side of it. So we're just going to have to wait and see where that goes. We've also joined in what I call the second tier of Obamacare. I talked a little bit about the lawsuit, the original challenge that we brought. And I think many Republican senators warned of this. I mean, it's very unfortunate that Congress would pass a 2,700-page document that, frankly, most of them didn't read. And even by the words of their leader, Pelosi, weren't going to read it and just we're going to pass it and then see what's in it. I mean, that's just not an effective or a wise way to govern. But we're starting to see now what's really in this document, and it's getting worse by the way Health and Human Services is interpreting it. One of the recent interpretations basically, in my opinion, violates the First Amendment and religious rights, and that's dealing with birth control. So there's been a new challenge by 17 attorney generals that the recent interpretation by Health and Human Services violates the freedom of religion, basically forcing different businesses or individuals, a part of that business, if they don't wish to, have to pay for insurance dealing with contraceptives. I always make it clear, it's not about birth control. I'm not trying to push birth control either way, but if somebody doesn't believe in it, I don't think that the First Amendment requires or allows the federal government to require them to facilitate it and pay for it. So we're hoping that case goes quickly because this is all coming down right now. I get the fact that everybody's having a hard time signing up and it's been a complete disaster. But we need to get this figured out because the way it's being interpreted, I think, is inappropriately hurting a lot of people. So I've kind of rambled on for quite a while, and I want to make sure that I address the questions you have about what's going on in the campaign, what's going on at the Attorney General's office. If the questions are too hard or you're mad as heck at me, I brought Jeremy Pancratz with me to field those questions. He's my aide. So what questions do you have about what we're doing? What advice do you have to help me better serve as AG? Yes?
Marty, I have a question.
Let me get you a microphone.
I can stand up and talk.
No, because people still can't hear you.
See, no matter how much I project, it doesn't matter. I'm going back to your forfeiture law, and this is just a point of interest for me. Today on the news, they stopped human trafficking from Wisconsin. Somebody came in with two ladies from Wisconsin, one was underage, and they caught her. That was on the news today. In forfeiture, would that only account for the stuff that they brought into South Dakota that you could pull back? Or how would that affect people coming into the state that don't actually live here?
The way I would envision, the question is, generally speaking, about how far does the forfeiture law encompass? I'm going to start big and then I'm going to narrow on it. We began drafting it. I feel strongly that there needs to be an innocent third-party provision. In other words, I'll use the drug case as an example. Let's just say that I'm a drug dealer and I borrow my parents' vehicle and I go do a drug transaction. I don't think my parents should lose their vehicle in that scenario. So there needs to be an innocent third-party provision. I know it's probably not going to be triggered as much on a human trafficking deal, but it could be an instance when a kid is doing that among, maybe a grandparent's vehicle or what have you. And so there needs to be an innocent third-party provision. So the one that we're going to draft is going to have that in there. Basically, it will be the broad concept that anything utilized to further the crime of human trafficking would be subject to the forfeiture law. So in your example, it wouldn't matter whether it's coming from Wisconsin, coming from wherever. If it was used to further that crime, it would be subject to that umbrella. There already is a federal forfeiture statute. I mean, that's frankly the reason that all those stings that South Dakota did out there in the rally, DCI, Division of Criminal Investigations, used state resources to do that. All the forfeiture went to the feds because our legislature's never given us a forfeiture statute. So the feds get that money. Now, we have a good relationship with federal authorities. Brendan Johnson is very much a part of that team. We'll get some of that back. But I would like to see us making those decisions, and that's in part why the legislature should take a serious look at this. This will drive you conservatives nuts, but one of the primary things that's a problem when it comes to these forfeitures and human trafficking and these solicitation of minors are these computers. So this is all done over the internet. So part of the enforcement mechanism is we come in and we make the arrest and we seize the computer because there's good evidence on that computer. Well, at the end of the day, because we don't have a forfeiture statute, did you know we have to give that computer back? Not only do we have to give that computer back, we have to scrub it and clean it, which costs you taxpayer dollars about $1,800 to $2,500 to do that. It's a complete waste of money. And so without a forfeiture statute, that's what's happening. So we arrest the bad guy, take his computer, and it's not the judge's fault, we don't have a forfeiture statute. We have to scrub and clean at taxpayer expense that piece of property and then give it back to him. If we had a forfeiture law, we probably wouldn't scrub and clean it, we'd just take a hammer to it and get rid of it and be done with it. But that's some of the reasons that I think we need a forfeiture statute, and I would suspect that it will be a close call whether or not we get one. It seems like it's common sense, but I've already run it by groups like this and had people say, well, how can you really be sure that you're not taking an innocent person's vehicle, et cetera? And you're never going to be fully sure, but that's what the system's for. That's what burdens of proof require the authorities to have to prove certain things. And so hopefully we can at least have a legitimate discussion and see where that goes. Yes?
Just follow up on the question of forfeiture law. Would the proposed forfeiture law allow property to be forfeited in the absence of a conviction? In some communities that do have forfeiture laws, a flaw in those is that a person, for example, we stopped at a traffic stop. They have what's considered a large sum of cash. The cash is confiscated upon the arrest. They are not prosecuted, they are not convicted of a crime, but the money is not returned. Hopefully there would be some provision to prevent potential abuse by law enforcement under those types of circumstances.
The question, you heard the question, it comes down to what type of a forfeiture law are we going to have. There's two types of forfeiture laws. One's a criminal forfeiture law, which is what the federal has. One's a civil forfeiture law. Different standards, different requirements. I'd like to see a civil forfeiture law that wouldn't require a conviction on the front end, and the reason for that is, let's just say we come in and we take that computer and it's got child porn on it, but let's just say we forgot to read Miranda, or we did something that cost us the conviction, okay? I still don't think I should have to give that, scrub and clean that computer and I'll get all the child porn off and everything and then give it back. And so I would like to see the protection to be on the innocent third party, the protection that we have the burden of proof. we'll have to sort out whether it's going to be by preponderance, clear and convincing, or what we're going to do yet. But that's part of the legislative process and the legislative discussion. But I think overall, I'd like to see a civil forfeiture based upon our drug forfeiture laws, because those have been tried and tested. We've litigated them. We know what the law is. Everybody understands what the law is. And I think it would be more, I guess, a more proven and effective way to do it. But again, there'll be a big discussion in the legislature about human trafficking. And I've told groups I plan on meeting with Family Policy Council, FHA yet, on the whole kidnapping and the prosecutorial immunity statutes, because I said I'd keep an open mind. But if I had to right now, if legislative session started today, I would propose a forfeiture statute. It would be a civil forfeiture statute. It would have a very strong innocent third-party statute with it to protect innocent people, and that's what I would propose. But we're not there yet. We're having those discussions. We actually have in place the legislature back, and I may have my times a little wrong, but when they did the criminal revisions, they really put in place a structure for forfeiture laws. And it appeared that they didn't quite finish it, and there's a provision that at the end that you could interpret it that the Attorney General should promulgate rules. My concern is this. I don't think the Attorney General, who sometimes, I will admit, I see the worst of the worst, is the one that should be promulgating the rules on forfeiture. I think our state legislature should. I think it's 105 men and women brought across the state, across section, to make that policy decision. I'll be in there fighting and arguing, but I'm concerned as Attorney General walking in and setting the rules. And there may even be some constitutional issues if that's what happens. And so I plan on being honest with the legislature and say, one way you can interpret what's already on the books is the Attorney General comes in and promulgates those rules. But I think it's a dangerous when you just have the executive branch, the enforcement branch, that's so deep into this and sees what happens to these victims making the call. I think you need to have the oversight of the legislature saying what the rules are, and you need to have the judge in place making sure everything's fair and even. What other questions about Doc?
I want to thank you. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have an Attorney General like you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
But you mentioned we got prosecutions against people who defraud the public. We've got a president who completely defrauded the American people. And when one guy was interviewed on this, there's no provision in our country to prosecute a president for anything he says. They can basically defraud the public at will. And we have the rule of law in this country, which we all should apply to all Americans. They've got all these different special interest groups that exempted themselves, and they're modifying the law at will. And now the Democrats, for political reasons, are trying to modify the law again so they can get reelected because it threatens their elections. What provisions do we have statewide all over the country with attorney generals, if this thing implodes, which it looks like it's going to preserve the liberty of our people, because this is the biggest threat to our country that we've ever faced, to uphold the freedoms of all Americans?
Well, there's a book, many of you may be familiar with Ken Cuccinelli. He's the Attorney General of Virginia, lost a very close election a couple days ago. Right now I think the Virginia Republican Attorney General is down by 117 votes. I may be a little bit off on that. Wrote a book, it's called The Last Line of Defense. And if you really look at what's been going on with health care, with the EPA, with the National Labor Relations Board, there's been a lot of inaction in Washington. And so really state governors and state attorney generals have really stepped up to the plate and mean a lot more than they used to. And, all I can do is assure you with the Republican colleagues, and I'm going to even say this with the Democrat colleagues. My Democrat colleagues, will defend their state also. And they're doing that with SO2. They did that with ObamaCare. Several of them have joined on other cases that would be contrary to the administration's desires. So the attorney generals are going to be safeguarding that, we always call it that federalism, that balance or partnership between federal authority and state authority. So I would think we will never allow it to completely unfold and become a complete disaster, and I think the courts would support us on that. You know, the biggest thing is the ballot box, and you've got elections coming up all across the nation for Congress, Senate. I mean, the control of Washington is in the balance. It's going to be decided in November of 2014. You're going to have, you know, right now it looks like we probably have 24 Republican Attorney Generals and 26 Democrat Attorney Generals. The voting public's going to decide what that number is going to be. Same with governors. And so part of the challenge has been the moving target, so to speak. I mean, we saw that. I mean, we focused a lot on the Commerce Clause fighting Obamacare because we had the president on tape saying this is not a tax. I mean, how could you have better evidence than that? I mean, we thought we were in pretty good shape, and then what happened. And so that's unfortunate. It would indicate that politicians sometimes are not held as accountable as they should be. But then the voters had another crack at it, and the voters didn't change it. And so you have to respect that process. But part of that respecting the process is the ability for state attorney generals, when your state and most importantly individual rights are trumped on, to stand up for those rights and to have the court address that. And I will make that guarantee and promise to you. I haven't been afraid to do it on Second Amendment rights, freedom of religion rights, across the board, to join with those attorney generals, and we'll keep doing that. And we've had good success with the EPA. We had partial success with Obamacare. I mean, it meant that Medicaid expansion, if that would have passed, I don't know how South Dakota would have a balanced budget and no state income tax. You'd either have to gut education, and I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, I don't want to do that, or completely and utterly gut the rest of state government. And there are people that need state government. I mean, government needs to help those people that are vulnerable and need help. And I just don't know what we would have done if we would have had to expand Medicaid. In 2019, the year 2019, our state would be in huge, huge trouble. But because of that lawsuit, we get a choice. At least at this point, in my opinion, the governor and the legislature have made the right choice that expansion might be right for some states, but it's not right for our state unless we're prepared to change the financial aspect of how we do business. And I mean, we have a balanced budget, we have a low unemployment rate. I mean, I'm not sure why you'd want to change that right now, but that would be your option. Other questions about what we're doing politically, what's going on in Pierre, what the Attorney General should be doing? Yep.
When we get rid of the EPA, is there anything about that agency that you would miss?
You know, it's a challenge for an old U.S. attorney that used to be responsible for defending their actions. It's a lot easier being an attorney general under this administration. The EPA has a place. You know, there are certain things, just like the FDA and the attorney generals going, it doesn't happen very often where the attorney generals say we need to have some uniform regulation. I mean, generally speaking, a properly run EPA, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act have some important provisions in. I mean, wouldn't be happy if North Dakota polluted the Missouri River down here. I mean, you need to have some uniformity. But I think that means, number one, you need to have the right people running it. And frankly, number two, Congress needs to do its job, and it's called oversight. And there isn't any oversight going on right now. You know, the oversight right now is unfortunately the attorney generals challenging the EPA. I thought we had a dozen suits, but I was told we had 15 going this weekend. So I know some of them double up, but that's an awful lot of lawsuits. And most of these lawsuits, we're just asking for the documents. I mean, we don't even know whether we got a legitimate challenge yet because there's no government transparency. They're withholding the documents that they're basing their decisions on. I mean, that's not government. And that's a serious problem. And you know, we're winning those, but the problem is it's delaying out. And I'm very concerned about this CO2. If we lose CO2, it's going to affect our small businesses. It's going to affect our agriculture. West River just got hammered with a blizzard. I mean, they can't take additional regulation and permitting like that. And there's no supporting documentation for much of this, and they won't provide it to us, which would only signal to me that it doesn't necessarily support what they're trying to do. I mean, if it did, why wouldn't they just give it to us? I mean, we literally are paying for it with our tax dollars. Why can't we have it? I mean, what's to hide? And so that's been very frustrating, but I think a properly run EPA that gives deference to state DNRs, but there are certain areas that we need some uniformity would be right, but we're not seeing it right now. Look at the National Labor Relations Board. I mean, South Dakota passes, along with 4 other states, a secret ballot amendment. It's common sense, for crying out loud. 70% of our public said it was common sense. And yet I get a letter as Attorney General from some appointed board run amok with 0 congressional oversight, telling me to declare it unconstitutional. I mean, that's not my job to declare it unconstitutional. My job is to defend it, not to declare it unconstitutional. But that's what's going on in Washington. It's very frustrating. But, you know, I just would give that reassurance that I think the governors and the attorney generals can make that difference. And I know that we were down a little bit this week. I mean, we started our meetings on Saturday, and when we started our meetings, Virginia was up 55 votes, I think, and then when we left, they're down 117. And so even though we're probably going to have less Republican attorney generals, I still believe the Democrats will step up and in the big issues, like they have in health care, on some of the EPA issues, they're going to stand with Republican attorneys general and make the difference. The only pitch I always have to the Republican AG Association is, you know, we have to work pretty hard to get our Democrat colleagues to come along. It'd be a lot nicer to have 30 or 35 Republican AGs that are just chomping at the bit to be a part of protecting some of these rights. Other questions about what we've got going on, what we're doing? Yep.
I have one for you. My understanding is that the health care penalty, which the Supreme Court called it a tax, started in the Senate, where it's supposed to start in the House. Is there any talk about bringing a lawsuit for that because it was unconstitutional?
I always want to be careful in answering these questions because I never know when one of my colleagues is going to bring a lawsuit like that. And I'm on camera saying that, nah, I don't think that dog ain't going to hunt. But I looked at it, had a couple lawyers look at it, and I know some of my other colleagues have looked at it. And while that is the preferred historical way it should be done, the law doesn't necessarily require it to be done that way. It should be done that way, but it wasn't. And so it does not appear at this point, and I think there was more than a handful of us AGs that looked at it. And I looked at it with General Pruitt from Oklahoma, who has been very strong in challenging Obamacare. And at this point, our belief was the strongest challenge was the birth control contraceptive issue. And I'll fully admit there's a standing issue. There's a question of whether or not that lawsuit needs to be brought by businesses or that lawsuit should be brought by attorneys general. And we face that fight. Every time we attorney generals fight the federal government, we have to face that fight. And usually we win it. We won it in Obamacare. You may recall they challenged us saying that, I mean, they didn't believe that we had the right to fight to protect our citizens' individual and states' rights. That was a pretty easy win for us. This one might be a little bit closer, but I still think we have the authority to. But that right now, at least in the minds of 17 state attorneys general, is the strongest challenge and the most viable challenge, and that's why I signed off on it, and I think 17 of my colleagues would say that's why they signed off on it. So, and I would anticipate that number is going to grow. Some attorneys general, our state's a little different. The attorney general controls litigation. Others need to work with their governors and their councils through that, and so that's going through the process. But in saying that, I want to be clear too. When I joined the challenge on healthcare originally, and when I joined this challenge, I've always had support of the governors and the legislature. I mean, when we joined Obamacare the first time, the legislature passed a joint resolution, House and Senate. Now it was pretty much a straight party vote, but supporting the Attorney General. And the governor supported me. I talked to some of my colleagues where their legislature cuts their appropriations, their governor cuts their appropriations. I have not had to experience that. So I have had a much more pleasant road than some of my, one of my Democrat colleagues was sued by the governor, who was the former Attorney General. And so it was just a complete mess. We've been much more responsible than that. And because I think people in South Dakota, and I want to be careful, I don't want to name businesses, but I was in Rapid City at a major business, and I came to talk to them about a whole bunch of issues. And I thought I was going to be talking about EPA issues. And the number one issue that they wanted to talk to me about was healthcare, because they had just been informed that they're a company that prides themselves in taking care of their employees, that they have always had a very strong benefit package to take care of their employees. That they just had to announce to their employees that, and this isn't anything, I used to be one of their lawyers, so I happen to know a little bit about their company. It's a good package, but it's not a Cadillac package. But under the definitions of Obamacare, it's a Cadillac package. So they get penalized by 30 or 40% tax. And so they just had to tell all their employees, even the ones that have been there 30 years, that your benefits, even though we strive and want to give them to you, are about to drop down to here. Your health care coverage is going to be reduced. And that's all they wanted to talk to me about. And because, these are people that, that's on their minds, that they want to provide, and I met with their CEO board, and that's what they talked to me about, is there anything we can do? So it's going to start really affecting, and I think you're starting to see it on TV, but it's going to start affecting real people. And then when 2019 comes, depending upon what South Dakota does with Medicaid, is going to be huge. And I strongly believe that government needs to help people that need help, and that there are good people that need to be on Medicaid, but that we don't need to expand Medicaid to 138% of the poverty rate and give those kind of increases. And the other thing, the budget's always talked about, what is this truly going to cost? And the numbers, I think, were initially somewhere between $53 and $62 million up until 2019, and then $36 million every year thereafter. That's a lot of money. My budget at the Attorney General's office is less than $22 million a year, so you can completely wipe me out, and you're still not going to cover this. But it doesn't include anything like Medicaid fraud. We have a Medicaid fraud unit at the Attorney General's office. If you're going to increase the number of applicants and everything, there's no numbers increasing that. There just has been very minimal thought process from the federal government on the expansion of Medicaid and what it costs. And disappointingly, even the discussions of people that talk about, well, we need to do this, they don't talk about the real costs. Where DSS are going to have to increase their administration, government. If you're going to put a whole bunch of more people on the rolls, you got to have more government to do that. The Attorney General, you're going to have more fraud. You're going to have to give the Attorney General some investigators. You're going to pay for all this, and that isn't in those figures. And so nobody's planned or thought through this. It's almost been like the whole Obamacare, just not thought through, not proper planning, and it's scary. Other questions about? Yep. Oh, I'm sorry.
I got it next. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you being here and answering the questions. Concerning our national debt of over $17 trillion now, throwing in the balanced budget amendment in Article 5 of our Constitution, this seems to be growing more on a national level to try to do something. Has that been discussed at all on the Attorney General's meetings, being this is going to end up in your offices if this happens?
Thank you, Representative. It hasn't. I mentioned a little bit about my trip on Sunday. We were scheduled for 17 meetings, and I self-inflicted myself into 18 meetings because I needed to meet with a South Dakota business that I just haven't had time with. Ken Cuccinelli, I think it was him that mentioned, he said we've been to 18 meetings and none of them were church, so I don't know how conservative group that we are, but we met on a lot of things, but that wasn't one of them. And I think the reason isn't one of them, not because it's not important, that's probably not an Attorney General function. If you truly look at the responsibility of the Attorney General, I kind of talked about it. Number one, it's to build law enforcement relationships to protect and make South Dakota a safer place. Number two is to preserve and protect your individual and states' rights. And three is consumers. That you're talking about is probably more in the bailiwick of you legislators. My job as Attorney General would be, and we've talked about it a little bit, is if an amendment were to come of that nature, is to legally make sure it follows the Constitution, or to legally make sure it's consistent with what the other states are doing. But that would be that's a policy call really up to the legislature. I mean, it's important. I mean, it's an important issue. I'm not denying that, but it just wouldn't be something that the attorney generals would necessarily be addressing. Thanks. I'm drinking a lot of water. It's been a long day. I've been in South Carolina, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Sioux Falls. So, yes.
Marty, it's good to hear you talking about the attorney generals and the governor taking a lot of responsibility that probably has been let go for some time because they expected the federal government to do something about it. But I think it's obvious to all of us that the federal government is so broke they can't do much of anything. And it's great to have you as an attorney general and the attorney generals throughout the state taking responsibility for getting some of these things done. And I think if we look at our state constitutions and our federal constitution, we would see that what the federal government is trying to do is so far out of bounds from what they're allowed to do that it's dependent upon state government to take care of some of these things that have really been let go to bureaucrats that we have no control over. We can talk to you, we can talk to the governor, we can talk to our legislature, but we can't talk to the bureaucrats and get anything worked out. So appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But I do need to say this, though. Sometimes I beat up on Washington, and I always need to clarify. I'm a huge John Thune fan. I mean, the problem John Thune has is he doesn't have the colleagues to get it done. I mean, he doesn't have a majority, and hopefully he might have one soon. But he's working hard for us, and so is Kristi Noem. I mean, people have been complaining, well, we don't have a farm bill yet. Well, I mean, Kristi Noem wants a farm bill, and she's working her tail off to get a farm bill. The problem is, you know, isn't coming from South Dakota, or, you know, I've had an opportunity to meet some of the North Dakota and Montana delegation. They're good people. But, I mean, it's got to be a very difficult job when you have a Congress that hardly is ever in session. You have a Senate that it would appear hardly ever even considers what the Republican colleagues have to say. I mean, ObamaCare, they never even asked them. So that's a tough job, but we are well represented in D.C. with Senator Thune and Congresswoman Noem, and so when I beat up on Washington, I'm not beating up on them. Yep.
I'm not beating up on those individuals.
No, I know.
What I'm saying is, we've got so much stuff that the federal government is trying to control by bureaucrats that even John Thune and Kristi don't have any control over.
Yep.
So the only way to get any control is through the more local attorney generals, our governor, and our state legislatures. And I think that they have to take a hold of these things and get them done, even though they may find out from Washington bureaucrats that it's not our responsibility to do it. But if we really look at what the Constitution says, those bureaucrats are way out of bounds from where they should be.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, that's been essentially the argument that the Attorney Generals have made about the 10th Amendment and about states' rights and all these lawsuits, that essentially the federal government has exceeded its authority, and coupled with the fact that they don't get anything done, that it's why that, you know, the way the Constitution is written, that unless it's enumerated responsibility or right within the Constitution, it falls back to the states and the individual. And so I couldn't agree with you more. And the challenge, though, is when we're litigating these deals, we don't have home court advantage. We're arguing these in front of federal judges. We don't get to argue these in front of our state judges. And so we've had some luck. We had luck. Boy, we won Obamacare at the trial level in the next intermediate appellate level, and then lost it on a 5-4 deal. But most in these EPA ones, the federal judges are siding with us on. But it's a much harder fight for we attorney generals to be addressing this on in federal court, where it's the federal judges that were selected through the federal process, and we have, you know, we have our arguments. We will continue to make them, and I think we're going to continue to have success. But back to kind of what you're talking about, I truly believe that the government that affects you the most should always be local government. It should be your school board, your city council, your county commission, your zoning boards. Then it should be Pierre if it has to be Pierre. And then after that, in minimal circumstances, it should be Washington. I mean, Washington should give us a strong national defense. It should give us some very general basic uniformity in certain things. And the rest, really, the states can do just fine without some of that bureaucracy.
Marty, we've got time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Penny and then Dr. Kevin.
And I'll stick, and because I was late too, I'll stick around. I know that the group may be dismissed, but I want to make sure that I give everybody time if you've got questions to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. So, fire away.
Okay. Back to the EPA. I'm a scientist at Novartis, and I'm kind of curious from a 360-degree perspective on the EPA with respect to how their data interpretations are with their scientific panels. Are there checks and balances anymore with the EPA, or are there scientists and their panels and the ones pushing for certain legislation? Are they all employed by the EPA, or do they even listen to independent scientific panels?
Well, the nearest I can tell is they're either employed by the EPA or the Sierra Club. We have not seen a separation. I can't tell you a lot about some of the inner science for 2 reasons, because I'm an electrical engineer, not a scientist. But number 2, even though we've asked for some of this stuff, they won't give it to us. We can't, that's our FOIA fight. And so we don't know exactly. The reason I make the comment about the Sierra Club, the new EPA deal is, and we're seeing it with timber, ethanol, what will happen is lawsuit will be filed by Sierra Club or some other organization, similar thought process, and they'll sue the EPA. And we won't really be a part of that lawsuit. And then they'll enter into some consent judgment and agreement without us, where basically the EPA gives away the farm in this lawsuit. Now it's been blessed by a federal judge in a settlement. And so we attorney generals have been watching that much more closely, and so that's why we're intervening in these lawsuits. And so you may get a pleading or a lawsuit that'll say, well, why is the Attorney General of South Dakota on the side of the EPA? Well, because we're fighting the Sierra Club and we didn't feel the EPA was going to fulfill our interests in the lawsuit. And so therefore we've essentially substituted us in for the EPA's responsibility. Now the problem with that is we're utilizing state tax dollars to do the job of the federal government. Now, we've been lucky because the attorney generals have done a masterful job of joining together. I mean, you're seeing 17 of us join, 20 of us join. Every time you say Texas, I mean, Greg Abbott, the future governor of Texas, he's got 700 lawyers. So it doesn't cost us anything at all. I think healthcare cost us $5,000 or $8,000. And so we're able to do this very cost effectively. But I mean, it still takes time, takes some money, takes some energy. But I can't fully answer your question because what I'm seeing is this masterful way of the EPA to give these settlements and consent decrees and then try to apply them nationwide, and then they withhold the documents, and so we can't. I mean, part of it would be is if they can legitimately show us that there's an activity that's hurting our environment. I mean, my responsibility as Attorney General is to reasonably protect that, and I would do that. But if they just simply say, no, we're going to do this, and we're going to force your state DNR to permit this, and we're going to force you as Attorney General to enforce these permits, that's kind of problematic. Was there one?
I don't figure that the Sierra Club has standing.
Well, those federal judges give, I mean, you look at those timber lawsuits. I mean, this timber deal, and the Black Hills is especially dear to me because that's where I grew up. But I mean, everybody loves the Black Hills, and we have had such a fight on timbering. Recently, since I've been Attorney General, we got sued in Colorado because we're a region. And I took a position as Attorney General, well, you know what? If we're going to litigate the Black Hills and the pine beetle, we should be doing that here in South Dakota. So we moved to have it brought back here. And I mean, everybody was amazed. The federal judge agreed and said, yeah, it's important South Dakota ought to be here. So we just get done with that one and we win it all. And it's the Sierra Club and the Friends of Norbeck. They sue us in Wyoming because, you know, Wyoming's got the Black Hills. So we won this whole big fight in Colorado, and we got to start the whole thing over again in Wyoming. And it's just a complete waste of judicial resources. And we've won it. I mean, we won it, and we're in good shape. And if Congress would have acted in 1996 or whenever, we would have addressed the pine beetle problem. So between the courts and Congress, we have a serious pine beetle problem. I mean, bore you to death, but I have a presentation that I give when I'm out in the Black Hills, and it's scary. About half of our Black Hills is infested with pine beetles for two reasons: court and Congress inaction. And the state of South Dakota is doing our part with Custer State Park, and the legislature's helping, and you got counties, Lawrence County's pumping in local money. I mean, this is all created because, the federal government didn't take care of their federal lands, because Congress and federal courts. And now we've finally gotten Wyoming taken care of and Colorado taken care of, and Congress has finally come to the party late and given some money, and we're getting it addressed. But we've got half of the Black Hills under pine beetle infestation. And nobody's ever been held accountable for it, nearest I can tell. So somebody else was there one more question? Oh, yep.
I'm going to refer to the Kermit Gosnell case in Philadelphia. I believe that occurred because the state of Pennsylvania did not inspect his ambulatory surgery area. Are we inspecting the ambulatory surgery clinics in the abortion clinics in South Dakota?
Here's where I got to be careful answering that for two reasons. Number one is that is not my department. That would be the Department of Health. Well, I mean, that would be under the governor, not under the Attorney General. That has been a point of litigation. We have been litigating abortion, I'm going to guess, since Mark Barnett was Attorney General. I don't want to get too far off on that issue, but in that litigation, we've prevailed 3 times, and now the law that the legislature passed, I call it the Rounds litigation, is now law. The Dugard litigation is still ongoing. About 2/3 of it's law. We're still fighting about 1/3 of it. It's all been upheld, not a piece of it's unconstitutional. And in that, there are allegations surrounding that would lead to the question of whether or not the Department of Health is doing that, but I don't know that it's ever been affirmatively answered. And I probably better not go further than that for 2 reasons. One is it's not my area, and I don't know for sure if I know the answer, and I think that the parties are not agreeing on that. Does that make sense? I didn't mean to dodge it. I'm just trying to be straight with you.
We're going to just continue with 2 more questions, but if you need to leave at 8:30, it is 8:30, so you are free to leave, but we're just going to continue because he's given us permission to. So
I will state this, though, but I do want to state this from a lawyer's standpoint. I mean, my position has always been if the legislature passes a law, that law is in place, and unless the federal judge shuts it down, it needs to be followed. And so in our statutory framework, and there's quite a bit in our pro-life statutory framework, there are certain requirements that have to be met, certain disclosures that have to be made, and it would strengthen my ability to argue this in court if all that was being followed and being checked. Is that fair? Okay.
Hi, my name's David Tennyson. I spent 32.5 years in law enforcement in Southern California. I'm born and raised South Dakota and just recently moved back. I see your number 1 priority, you mentioned it tonight, I saw it on your website, is basically as a crime-fighting organization. And one of the ways you do that is by assisting county and city law enforcement. One of the things that I've seen from afar, and a few weeks ago the Argus had a series on the number of peace officers that have lost their certification, and the problems with smaller communities in South Dakota, especially small cities and even some of the small counties with, a 2-person sheriff's office. They're having problems hiring qualified people, and one of the areas they're really lacking in is doing background investigations. And I know there's just a few around Sioux Falls where they've been hired and shortly thereafter lost their job. Has the Attorney General's office done anything to help local law enforcement to ensure when they're hiring someone for these positions that they're qualified and have been vetted, or what suggestions would the Attorney General's office make?
The answer is yes, and then let me build upon why it's yes what we're doing, but I got to give you a basic understanding. To be a law enforcement officer in the state of South Dakota, we have 1,790 certified law enforcement officers. We're going to have about another 25 Friday when we graduate them. To be certified in South Dakota, you either, and the majority of them have to do this, you come to a basic certification course in peer. It's about a 14-week course. You leave your loved ones, you come to peer, you learn everything from how to drive under adverse conditions to how to pick up pieces of evidence, how to interview, how to gain a confession, how to preserve evidence, how to shoot, all that business. 14 weeks, you pass that course and you become a certified officer. The other way you become a certified officer is through reciprocity. You're an officer such as you in California, you come to South Dakota, you pan out, we run your background checks, make sure you haven't done anything else bad, and then you have to take what's called the reciprocity course. It's about a week-long course. The third way, and I'm really proud of this, and I'm trying to further promote this, is through education. We have some great technical schools in South Dakota. And if you take criminal justice, one of the, right now there's 2 accepted colleges either at Votech or Southeastern, you take that law enforcement class and you pass it, we will give you that reciprocity, and then you still have to come pass our week-long reciprocity course in the background, and then you become an officer. So those are the 3 ways that you become an officer. And the backgrounds are run through that. Where part of the issue is, if you're hired in South Dakota or elected sheriff, so to speak, you have what's called I'll call it a 1-year grace period. That's truly, I mean, if we were lawyers and we were going to argue some finer points, I'm just giving you the broad brush. There's that week-long period where you can work for an agency or be sheriff without being certified. So in that week time, or that 1-year time frame, we've seen some problems. We've had some issues. In fact, Senator Teason's point blank asked me, what's my position on shortening up that 1-year grace period, because people are kind of operating without the full background or the full certification potentially during that 1-year time frame. I mean, here's the problem. Small town South Dakota, they have very little money. Sheriff quits. County Commission appoints a new sheriff. What's better? So am I going to leave them without a sheriff for 14 weeks while he comes to our law enforcement facility, or am I going to allow them to, within that year, figure out how to make it work to get him educated? So it's a balance, and I don't know what the right answer is. You in Sioux Falls are lucky because you have the financial backing, you have the ability that Chief Barthel doesn't have his officers that way. In other words, you don't start for him until your background's done and you've passed basic, and that's why you don't see those as many problems. Although we've had issues in big cities too. I mean, obviously the Argus article, was factual. I can't deny that. Now the other thing I would tell you, to lose your certification, the Law Enforcement Training Board is about 13 individuals. I serve on it, the director of DCI, the head of the Highway Patrol, the head of the FBI, a very conservative sheriff, a very conservative mayor, a very conservative councilman. It's a tough board. If you mess up, you're probably losing your ticket. People have been thrown out of Law Enforcement Academy for having a cell phone go off. Now they've been warned about it a couple of times, but that's how serious it is. Law enforcement officer lost their certification because they shot a sign out of their vehicle when they were drinking. So we take it very serious. So I would suggest to you that those numbers and the talk about decertification, while it's serious, we hold ourselves to an awful high standard. And you're removed from our profession much easier than other professions. And I don't say that, it's how it is. I'm an engineer and I'm a lawyer. And neither of my professions police it as hard, and nor should they police it as hard as we do at the law enforcement deal. But it's very conservative. You asked about what we're doing. We're talking about changing the 1 year. I don't know where I'm at on that. We are being much more open to doing some background work early if counties ask us, but that's the key. The county has to ask us. In other words, if they hired Joe Deputy and they don't tell us, we don't even know how to run the background on them. And so there's got to be that communication. Another issue is pay, and that's political. That's county commissioners and city councilmen making decisions. It's legislators. I don't see any appropriators here, but I point blank showed them the numbers last session and said, our officers are making less than other states. Other states are poaching my scientists that do DNA, they're poaching my good agents. I mean, the governor poached my second and third in control at DCI. It's money. So you got to be prepared to pay for it. And the other pitch out of the legislature, it's a pretty cheap investment for you. Because I tell you what, you hire the guys that kick down the wrong door and hurt somebody, that lawsuit's big money. You know, last year, I can't remember, DCI, I don't know, we served 782 search warrants and we didn't get sued a single time. That's a pretty good investment for the state. It doesn't cost you much to pay these people that go out. I mean, I just listened at the mall to all those names that were, you know, officers that lost their lives in the line of duty. Since I've been U.S. Attorney and Attorney General, I've buried 5 officers. And we don't pay them enough. And I think the biggest solution, and that's part of where the Attorney General needs to come in, and that's why I put that chart together, and I showed the legislature, and they cut me anyhow, but then, you know, the Argus ran the article, talked about how the AG said, you're going to have problems, and they cut our training. We went from 65 advanced courses to 60, even though in the last year we've had 6 involved officer shootings. Our officers have either been run over, shot at, or had to shoot somebody 6 times. And yet the legislature cut our funding from 65 to 60 advanced courses. And so part of the job of Attorney General is to point that out and to fight for that and to say, these are the numbers. So that's easy for me to fight for that, but I don't know on the 1 year. There probably is a happy medium and a balance, and maybe that 1 year becomes 6 months. But a lot can happen in 6 months. You got a guy running around that hasn't had his background done and hasn't been trained, and he's got a gun. So I don't know the answer to that. I think Chief Teason is going to, at some point, force the issue. And I want to sit down with... I've been good about forming sheriff groups that include the big and little sheriffs. We have the 24/7 program where I have an advisory group of sheriffs, and I always want to have the big city sheriffs, the little town sheriffs, and the guys in between. And so I think it gives you a good cross-section. I want to know what they think about it. I know that if we shorten that time frame, it's going to hurt the little guys. And one option may be to find, you know, money's tight, but to find some way to help. The other thing that I will say that I've done to help those smaller departments, drug control funds. We talked a little bit about the forfeiture on the human trafficking. There are police departments that didn't have safety vests. They're kicking down doors and they don't have safety vests. So I took drug control money, because, and it's fair, the legislature says I can use that money if it's to help combat drug crimes. Well, if you're kicking down doors of drug cases, and we bought police officers vests. Some of them didn't have shields. So we recently bought some shields, some vests. Some of them didn't have radios. We bought some radios. I mean, basic things that big city Sioux Falls and Rapid take for granted, the smaller guys don't have. And so some of it's money, and that just has to be addressed. But I can do that as Attorney General, and I don't get any pushback from, you know, Chief Barthel doesn't say a word to me when I go buy vests for the little guy, even though he may have gotten the drug money from something he did. In fact, you're very lucky in the Sioux Falls area. I've seen Chief Barthel and used equipment that he doesn't need anymore give it to smaller agencies just to protect their officers. Because, you know, at the end of the day, when the call comes in that, you know, either somebody's barricaded up in a town or somebody's been shot, I mean, we all come in and help. I mean, we have a great cooperation task force in South Dakota, but probably the circling back to answer your question is it's resources, and as Attorney General I can help on that, and it's that 1 year time frame, and I don't know that there's a good answer to that. And it may get pushed where it becomes a legislative issue. The legislature may end up having to debate it and make that decision. Was there any other?
One last question.
Okay.
The learned real scary with this present administration is that Obama's stacking the courts, and if he stacks the courts with his far left judges and Supreme Court justices, what recourse would we have anymore?
You know, throughout our history of a country, we fight about stacking courts. You know, one president thought he was going to add a whole bunch of new justices to try to address that. I mean, I think it's a political process. It's certainly the job of the U.S. Senate to a confirmation process, and that's your protections. we have a much more divided court now than we did when I was a young lawyer starting out. I mean, many of our decisions are now 5-4, sometimes 6-3. Obviously, Justice Ginsburg is going to be retiring pretty soon, and I think when that happens, that the balance of the court could change significantly. But you asked the question, what can be done about it? And I think it's the political process. It's two things. It's the political process. Whoever's the next president is going to pick several Supreme Court justices. But you know what? It's maybe time for the U.S. Senate to do its job, and that is a confirmation process. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. They need to do their job and make sure that whoever the next justice is qualified and is the right person for the job. I'm not a believer in litmus tests. I think that can be dangerous. I think everybody believed that a person like John Roberts would never support Obamacare. But I think you need to have a confirmation process that, while it's not a litmus test on something, flushes out a person's general views, a person's qualifications to serve as a judge, their background, to make sure there isn't something out there that somebody could hold them blackmail on. But that should be a thorough and a lengthy process. And we've seen and it's been ugly. I mean, look when Clarence Thomas was confirmed. I mean, that was a confirmation hearing. It was ugly, but you know what? We knew what we got. But they haven't really, the Senate hasn't done that. I mean, there are certain jobs that it's advise and consent. When I was U.S. Attorney, I mean, I can say that I was unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Well, that's an advise and consent. That's Senator Thune gets to pick his U.S. Attorney, and unless there's a serious problem there, they all agree to it. But the picking of a judge is different. That is a confirmation process. That's where they need to vet you, you need to testify, you need to be qualified, you need to have the horsepower to be making the decisions that are affecting real people all the way down the line. And so hopefully it's either addressed at the ballot box, or certainly the protection is the Senate needs to do its job.
I think we're done.
I'll stick around here. I want to circle back to where I started, though. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Is I get to serve as Attorney General. I mean, this is the best job I've ever had. And I've had good jobs being U.S. Attorney, a partner law firm, but I love this job. But I get to do this job because of you. You guys have been very supportive of me, and I just want to say thank you very much. And I'll stick around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we not love Marty Jackley?